Ethan had never planned to start over again in his late 30s, but life didn't care about plans. After his quiet divorce, he moved into a new apartment complex in Seattle, hoping for nothing more than peace. The air was different, they're fresh, .com, and anonymous. That was all he wanted, to be unseen, to breathe, to rebuild. But that peace didn't last long, because just across the hall lived Claire, and from the first moment he saw her, he knew his calm life was about to change. It happened on his second morning there. Ethan was carrying a heavy box of books when the elevator doors opened, and she stepped out, a woman in her mid-30s, elegant but warm, with that quiet confidence that drew people in without her trying. She wore a soft beige sweater, her hair tied up, holding a grocery bag in one hand and a phone in the other. She smiled politely. "New neighbor?" she asked, her voice calm but kind. Ethan nodded, caught off guard by how natural she sounded. "Yeah, just moved in yesterday." She extended a hand. "I'm Claire. Welcome to the building." It was a simple greeting, nothing more, but something about the way she said it lingered in his mind all day. Later that evening, he saw her again in the hallway, fumbling with her keys and a handful of mail. One envelope slipped from her hand, and Ethan quickly bent down to pick it up. Their fingers brushed for a second, and both laughed awkwardly. "Thanks," she said softly. "These keys always give me trouble." He smiled. "Guess they like keeping you company?" She laughed. Again, genuine easy, and for the first time in months. Ethan felt something he thought he'd lost. Warmth. Over the next few days, they kept crossing paths, sometimes at the mailbox, sometimes in the elevator. Each time it was small talk about the weather, work, or the best place nearby for coffee. But beneath those ordinary words, something unspoken began to build. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was quiet, steady, like a soft hum that only they could hear. Ethan tried not to think much of it. She wore a simple ring on her finger, a gold bandand, mentioned her husband once, saying he traveled a lot for work. That was enough for Ethan to remind himself to stay distant. She was kind, friendly, but she wasn't his to think about. Still, that didn't stop the thoughts from coming. He'd catch himself glancing toward her door when he passed by, or listening for the sound of her footsteps in the hallway. He didn't mean to. It just happened. Sometimes at night, when the world outside went quiet, he'd notice the faint glow of her apartment light through the crack under her door. She was awake too, he realized. Maybe reading, maybe thinking. It made him feel less alone. One Friday afternoon, he came home early and found her outside the building, struggling with her grocery bags in the wind. Without a second thought, he jogged over to help. "Here, let me," he offered, taking a few bags from her. She smiled in relief. "You always show up right when I need a rescue," she said lightly. "Maybe I just have good timing," he replied. They carried the groceries up together, talking about little things, her husband's long work trips, Ethan's freelance projects, how quiet the building could be on weekends. When they reached her door, she turned to him. "You should come by sometime for coffee," she said casually. "I make a mean cappuccino." He hesitated only for a moment. "Maybe I will," she smiled. "I'll hold you to that." After she disappeared into her apartment, Ethan stood there for a few seconds, feeling something unfamiliar, something dangerous but alive. He walked into his own place, set down his keys, and exhaled slowly. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. Not again. Not about someone who wasn't his. But no matter how many times he told himself to let it go, the thought of her smile kept returning. The following week, their paths crossed even more. Sometimes she'd wave at him through the window of the lobby coffee shop. Other times they'd meet in the parking lot, and she'd stop to chat. There was always that same warmth, the same unspoken connection neither of them named. Ethan started to notice the little things, the way her eyes softened when she laughed, how she always tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, and how her voice lowered when she talked about something that mattered. It wasn't just attraction. It was comfort, familiarity to people who understood loneliness in the same language. Then one evening, he saw her sitting on the apartment stairs, looking lost in thought. She was holding her phone, her eyes tired. Ethan hesitated but approached anyway. "Everything okay?" he asked gently. She looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. Yeah, just one of those days, she sighed. My husband's flight got delayed again. He was supposed to be home tonight. Ethan sat down beside her, not too close. That must be tough. She nodded. It is, but you get used to it after a while. Her tone wasn't bitter, just tired. For a moment, they sat in silence, listening to the quiet hum of the hallway. Then she said softly, sometimes I think people meet at the wrong time. Ethan glanced at her, unsure what to say. What do you mean? She gave a faint smile. Just that timing can be cruel. You meet someone who feels right, but everything around it is wrong. She looked away before he could answer. Ethan's heart beat faster, but he didn't respond. He knew what she meant. He'd felt it since the first day she smiled at him in the elevator. It wasn't about crossing lines or chasing what couldn't be his. It was about the simple, painful truth that two people could find a rare connection in the most inconvenient of circumstances. The air between them grew heavier. Ethan stood up slowly, trying to shake the feeling before it grew deeper. You should get some rest, he said softly. She nodded. Yeah, I should. She looked up at him with a sad smile. Thanks for checking on me, he smiled back. Anytime. That night, as Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he couldn't stop thinking about her words about timing, about loneliness, about how easily kindness could turn into something more. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, but he knew one thing for certain. Claire wasn't just another neighbor. She had already found her way into his thoughts, and no matter how much he tried to deny it, she wasn't showing mercy to his heart. It was the kind of story that didn't need grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was quieter than that. Two souls, both carrying silent aches, standing on opposite sides of the same hallway. Pretending the distance between their doors was enough to keep their hearts apart. But Ethan knew better. Sometimes mercy wasn't silence. Sometimes mercy was walking away before feelings became confessions. And deep down, he wasn't sure if he still had the strength to walk away. After that evening on the stairs, Ethan tried to put distance between himself and Claire. He told himself it was just a neighborly connection, nothing more, and he needed to stay focused on his own life. He started leaving earlier for work, taking longer routes through the building, avoiding the elevator when he thought she might be around. But the truth was, it didn't help. Every time he saw her, even for a second, that same quiet pull came back stronger than before. It wasn't that Claire was doing anything wrong. She was just kind, open, and honest in a way that made Ethan forget how complicated things were. Sometimes she'd wave when she saw him through the window of the lobby cafe. Other times, she'd greet him with that familiar smile that felt too warm for a simple hello. He would tell himself, "Don't read into it." But his heart didn't listen. The distance he was trying to build only made him think of her more. One rainy evening, everything changed. Ethan was sitting at his kitchen table working on a project when he heard a knock on his door. It was soft at first, then a little louder. When he opened it, Claire was standing there holding a small book in her hand. Her hair was damp from the rain, and she looked both nervous and relieved to see him. "Hey," she said, her voice quiet. "I hope I'm not bothering you. I just came to return your book. You lent it to me last week." Ethan frowned slightly. Book? He realized she must have borrowed it when they talked about favorite authors weeks ago. He had completely forgotten. "Oh, right," he said, smiling. "No bother at all." She handed it to him, but instead of leaving, she lingered in the doorway, glancing toward the window where the rain was pouring down. "The storm got worse," she said softly. "I didn't bring an umbrella." Ethan hesitated for a second. "You can wait here until it slows down." She nodded gratefully and stepped inside. Her presence filled the quiet apartment instantly. They sat at the small kitchen table, sipping tea while the rain hit the windows. What began as casual conversation slowly turned into something deeper. Claire spoke about her life, how Daniel, her husband, traveled almost half the year. "He's not a bad man," she said, looking down at her cup. He just lives in a world that doesn't have much room for me anymore." Ethan didn't know what to say. He understood that kind of emptiness, the quiet space between two people who had grown apart. "That sounds lonely," he said gently. She nodded. "It is. You start to forget what it's like to really talk to someone." Then she looked up at him and added, "But somehow it's been easier to talk to you." The room went silent after that. Ethan felt his chest tighten, not from guilt, but from the truth in her words. He wanted to tell her he felt the same, that talking to her made his days feel lighter, that her presence had become the small brightness in his routine. But he didn't. He couldn't. Instead, he changed the topic, asking about her favorite places in the city. She smiled, grateful for the shift, and the tension slowly eased. Hours passed without either of them noticing. They talked about movies, music, even silly things like bad takeout food. It felt normal, easy, but underneath that ease was something neither of them dared to mention. When the rain finally stopped, Claire stood up reluctantly. "I should go," she said softly. "It's getting late." Itson followed her to the door. "Yeah, of course." But just before she stepped out, she paused and turned back. Her expression had changed. No smile this time, just honesty. "You know," she said quietly, "sometimes being good hurts more than being bad." Ethan froze. He didn't know how to respond. Her words hung in the air, heavy but true. She gave him a small, sad smile. "Good night, Ethan." And then she was gone. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He replayed that moment over and over, the look in her eyes, the sound of her voice, the truth behind her words. It wasn't about temptation or guilt. It was about two people who were both lonely in their own ways, both pretending they could control something that was already out of their hands. He wanted to tell himself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a fleeting connection brought on by timing and circumstance. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Over the next few days, he tried harder to stay away. But it felt like the universe had other plans. They kept running into each other in the parking lot, by the elevator, even at the grocery store nearby. Every time it felt unplanned but fated. She'd smile, he'd smile back, and they'd fall into easy conversation again. The more he tried to keep things casual, the more impossible it became. One evening, he saw her sitting alone on a bench, outside the building, scrolling through her phone with a distant look. He almost walked past, but stopped. "Hey," he said. She looked up, surprised, but glad to see him. "Oh, hey, just needed some air." Ethan sat down next to her. "Everything okay?" She shrugged. "Daniel called. He's going to be away for another 2 weeks. He sounded tired, but I think I'm more tired of missing someone who doesn't seem to miss me." Ethan stayed quiet, unsure what to say. She looked at him, her eyes softer now. "You ever feel like you're stuck between doing the right thing and doing what makes you feel alive?" He nodded slowly. "More times than I can count." The way she looked at him, Net, wasn't longing. Not yet. It was recognition. Two people, both caught between responsibility and feeling, both pretending they could control what was happening. When she finally stood to leave, she smiled faintly. "Thanks for listening, Ethan. You're easy to talk to." He smiled back, though his heart felt heavy. Anytime. That night, the quiet of his apartment felt heavier than usual. Every sound reminded him of Hertha's soft laugh. The way she said his name, the loneliness in her voice when she talked about her husband. He wasn't sure what they were anymore. Friends, confidants, or two people standing too close to a line neither wanted to cross. He tried to distract himself with work, music, anything, but nothing helped. Her face, her voice, her words, they lingered. It wasn't love yet, but it was something close, something dangerous. He kept thinking about what she'd said. Sometimes being good hurts more than being bad. And the worst part was, she was right. Staying away didn't make him feel better, made him feel emptier. He realized he wasn't just drawn to her. He cared about her happiness, her peace. He wanted to be someone who made her smile again, But that was the problem. He knew exactly where that path led, and he couldn't afford to lose control. He'd already been through heartbreak once. He couldn't handle it again, still as he lay awake that night staring at the ceiling. One thought refused to leave his mind: if doing the right thing hurt this much. Maybe the real question wasn't about what was right or wrong. Maybe it was about what the heart could endure before breaking all over again. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet connection between Ethan and Claire only grew deeper. Even though neither of them spoke about it. They didn't text or call, yet somehow they found each other again and again by chance. In moments that felt ordinary, but weren't. A passing smile in the parking lot. A brief talk in the hallway. A wave through the window when one was leaving for work. Every time they met, it felt a little harder to walk away. Ethan told himself it was harmless. They hadn't crossed any lines. They were just friends, neighbors who understood each other in ways no one else did. But the truth was, it wasn't just friendship anymore. It was something quiet and powerful. A longing neither could name out loud. And the silence between them began to carry more meaning than their words ever could. One Sunday morning, as Ethan was making coffee, he heard a knock at his door. When he opened it, Claire stood there, smiling a little awkwardly. "Sorry to bother you," she said. "I was trying to fix a cabinet handle in my kitchen, but it came loose completely. Do you happen to have a screwdriver?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, of course. I'll grab it." She smiled with relief. "Would you mind helping me with it? It's one of those old hinges I can't seem to get right." He wanted to say no for his own sanity, but instead, he found himself following her across the hall, toolbox in hand. Her apartment smelled faintly of vanilla candles and coffee. The morning light streamed through the window, soft and warm. "It's that one," she said, pointing to a loose handle under the counter. Ethan knelt to fix it while she leaned against the counter, watching. They talked casually while he worked about her husband's latest trip, about his writing projects, about anything that wasn't the heavy truth sitting between them. But as minutes passed, the air seemed to grow heavier. She laughed softly at something he said, and when he looked up, their eyes met. It wasn't an accident. Neither looked away. The sound of rain began to tap gently against the window, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade. Then suddenly, the lights flickered. The soft hum of the refrigerator stopped, and the apartment went dark. A power cut. Claire gasped lightly, then laughed nervously. "Perfect timing," she said. "This always happens when I'm cooking or fixing something." Ethan chuckled, but his voice felt tight. "I think it's just the storm." They stood there in the dim light from the window, barely a few feet apart. Neither moved. Ethan could hear the rain outside and his own heartbeat. He could see the reflection of uncertainty in her eyes. The same hesitation, the same longing he'd tried to hide. "Claire," he said quietly. "Maybe I should go," she interrupted softly. "You don't have to." Her voice trembled just enough for him to notice. The silence after that was heavier than words. It wasn't about desire or impulse. It was about everything they hadn't said. Everything they'd been pretending not to feel. Ethan took a slow breath, forcing himself to look away. "We shouldn't," he whispered, his voice low but steady. Claire's expression softened with understanding. "I know," she said quietly. Sometimes it feels like we met to remind each other we're still human." He smiled faintly, even though his heart ached. "Maybe," he said, standing up. "But that reminder can break us if we let it go too far." She looked down, blinking away a tear she probably didn't want him to see. "You're right," she whispered. "I just wish life was a little less complicated." Storm outside grew stronger. They stood by the window for a moment, watching the rain hit the glass. Neither spoke. Ethan wanted to say something comforting, something that would make her feel less alone, but every word felt dangerous. So instead, he said quietly, "Sometimes doing nothing is the only way to keep from losing everything." She turned to him with a small, sad smile. "And sometimes doing nothing hurts more than losing everything," she replied. For a moment, neither moved. Then she stepped back and took a deep breath. "Thank you for fixing the handle," she said softly. "And for being kind." Ethan nodded. "Always." He gathered his tools and walked to the door. But before leaving, he looked back once more. She was standing there by the window, her arms crossed, staring into the rain. She looked strong, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes that broke him a little. He wanted to go back, to say something, anything, but he didn't. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. That moment in her kitchen stayed with him for days. He couldn't stop thinking about it, the look in her eyes. The storm outside, the silence that said everything. Words couldn't. He tried to move on, throwing himself into work, avoiding her apartment entirely. But every night when he passed her door, he felt the same ache in his chest. Then one evening, as he was heading out to get groceries, he saw Claire coming up the stairs. She smiled politely, but didn't stop. "Hey," he said gently. She hesitated. "Hey." Her tone was quiet, almost distant. For a second, they just stood there facing each other in the hallway where everything had begun. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Yeah, just trying to keep busy." There was a pause before she added, "Daniel's coming home tomorrow. He's been away for 6 weeks." Ethan forced a small smile. "That's good." "Yeah," she said softly, though her expression didn't match her words. Then, after a moment, she added, "You know, Ethan, I'm glad we never crossed that line." Her voice was steady but gentle. He could tell she meant it not because she didn't feel something, but because she did. It was her way of saying that what they shared mattered too much to ruin. Ethan nodded. "Me too," he said quietly, "but I'll be honest, I thought about it." She looked at him with a sad smile. "So did I." They both laughed softly after that, not because it was funny, but because it was the only thing to do when emotions were too heavy to hold. The moment passed quietly, but it left a trace that wouldn't fade. That night, Ethan sat by his window, looking at the faint light from her apartment across the hall. The storm had cleared, but his thoughts hadn't. He realized that sometimes the hardest part of caring for someone wasn't letting them go, was never letting it begin in the first place, for both of them. That morning in the kitchen had been a turning point. They hadn't crossed the line, but they had seen what waited on the other side. It wasn't passion or excitement, it was regret, and both of them knew it still. He couldn't help but think of her whenever he heard the rain. That sound would always remind him of the morning they almost gave in, the morning they both chose restraint over desire. It wasn't a grand love story, it was a quiet one, built on what could have been and never was. And as the days passed, Ethan began to understand something he hadn't before. Sometimes, love isn't about possession or confessions. Sometimes it's about caring enough to stop even when your heart doesn't want to. And though Claire never said it again, Ethan knew that she felt the same that in her silence. She had already said everything he needed to hear. A few weeks passed after that quiet morning in Claire's kitchen, and everything between her and Ethan changed, but only in the smallest, saddest ways. They still saw each other in the hallway sometimes, still exchanged polite smiles, still said hello when their paths crossed. But the warmth that once lived between them had turned into something softer, quieter, like a memory they were both trying to protect. Ethan noticed the for sale sign before she mentioned it. It was a cold afternoon in early March when he saw the paper taped to her door. His chest tightened, but he pretended it didn't matter. Later that evening, she knocked on his door, just like she had that night during the storm. She looked calm, but her eyes gave her away. "I wanted to tell you before you saw it," she said softly. "Daniel got a new job in Oregon. We're moving next month." For a moment, Ethan didn't speak. He just nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "That's great," he said finally. "A new start." Claire smiled, but it was the kind of smile that hides sadness. "Yeah, I guess so." She hesitated before adding, "You've been a good neighbor." "Ethan, better than I deserved." He wanted to say something meaningful, something that would make her stay or at least let her know what she had meant to him, but the words wouldn't come. He just smiled back and said, "You'll be missed." After that, things moved fast. Her apartment slowly emptied over the next few weeks. Ethan could hear the faint sound of boxes being taped shut, furniture being moved, and the echo of her footsteps through the hall. Each sound felt like time running out. They didn't talk much during those days. Maybe it was easier that way. Then, one evening, just before she was set to leave, she knocked on his door again. She wasn't carrying anything this time. No books, no tools, no excuses. Just herself. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," she said. He nodded and let her in. Her apartment was nearly bare, just a few boxes stacked by the door. They sat on the floor drinking coffee from paper cups, talking like old friends who didn't know when they'd see each other again. "Do you ever wonder how life might have turned out if we met under different circumstances?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked at her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "I think about it more than I should." She sighed. "Me too." There was a long pause before she said, "You made this place feel like home when it didn't anymore. I didn't realize how lonely I was until I met you." Ethan swallowed hard. "You don't have to thank me for that. I do," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Because I've made mistakes if you hadn't been stronger than me." He shook his head slowly. "You were stronger. You walked away before either of us could lose something we'd never get back." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. This time it was peaceful, like they both understood something important. Some connections aren't meant to last forever. They exist to remind you what love and honesty can still feel like, even if it's brief. As she stood to leave, Claire walked to the door and turned back to face him. "Take care of yourself, Ethan," she said softly. "And don't hide from people who make you feel again." He smiled gently. "Only if you promise the same." She nodded, then stepped forward and hugged him. It wasn't a desperate embrace, just long enough to say everything words couldn't. When she pulled away, her eyes glistened. "Goodbye," she whispered. "Goodbye, Claire," he said quietly, and then she was gone. The hallway door closed behind her with a soft click, and the sound echoed longer than it should have. That night, Ethan sat by the window, watching the rain return, just like it had the first night she knocked on his door. Across the hall, her apartment was dark, empty. He tried to read, to work to distract himself, but everything in his home reminded him of Hertha teacups, the faint smell of her perfume that lingered from her last visit. The screwdriver he never gave back. He wasn't in love with her. Not in the way stories usually describe it. It was something gentler and more painful. It was connection without promise, understanding without words, and love that stayed unspoken because saying it would ruin everything it stood for. The next morning, when he stepped into the hallway, her door was wide open. Movers carried out the last few boxes. He peeked inside once. The place looked smaller without her laughter, emptier without the warmth she carried everywhere she went. He thought about going over to say one last goodbye. But when he looked out the window and saw her standing beside the moving truck, he stayed still. She looked peaceful, almost free. She got into the car with Daniel, and as the truck pulled away, Ethan whispered softly, "Be happy." Weeks passed, then months. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm, though nothing felt quite the same. New neighbors moved into Claire's old apartment, young couple who filled the halls with cheerful chatter. Ethan smiled politely at them, but every time he passed that door, a quiet ache stirred inside him. Not sadness exactly, just the memory of something unfinished. Sometimes late at night, when the world outside was still and the city lights flickered through his blinds, Ethan would imagine hearing her laugh in the hallway again. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks. Or maybe certain people leave traces that never really fade. He'd think about all the moments they shared. The first time he helped her with her groceries, the long conversation on that rainy night, the storm that brought them too close, and the goodbye that finally gave them peace. Each memory was soft, distant, but alive. He realized that not every story of connection ends in love or heartbreak. Some end in quiet gratitude. Claire had reminded him that he could still feel deeply, still care, still believe in genuine connection after everything he'd been through. She came into his life when he was rebuilding himself, and maybe that's why she had to leave when she did. She wasn't meant to stay. She was meant to show him that his heart still worked. Months later, when spring came, Ethan sat on his balcony one morning with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise over the city. The air smelled fresh, and the world felt new again. He didn't feel lonely anymore, just thankful. He whispered into the quiet morning air, "Claire, wherever you are, I hope you found peace." And deep down, he knew she probably did. Because sometimes the people who stir your heart the most aren't meant to be part of your story forever. They're meant to remind you what love, patience, and mercy truly mean. For Ethan, the story with Claire was never about what almost happened. It was about what didn't and how that restraint, that choice to stay kind and honest, became its own kind of love story. And even though she was gone, every time he heard the rain against the window, he couldn't help but smile and think, my neighbor wasn't showing mercy, but maybe that's how she taught me to heal.